Okay, welcome everyone to this joint NCF NSRN webinar. Jointly hosted by the Non-Religion in a Complex Future Research Project, which I'm happily a part of, and by the Non-Religion and Secularity Research Network, which I'm happily the current president of. So, welcome everyone. My name's Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme. I'm an associate professor in sociology at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and I will be your MC host for today. So I'd first like to acknowledge that where I'm currently working at the University of Waterloo and nearby Wilfrid Laurier University, they're both situated on the Haldimand Tract. So that's land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River and is within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. So our webinar today is all about this thing, this new book in front of me, titled Beyond Doubt, The Secularization of Society, published this year, fresh off the press with New York University Press. So we're joined by the three co-authors of this wonderful new book. So first off, Isabella Kasselstrand is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Aberdeen in the UK. And Isabella uses quantitative and mixed methods. Her publications explore secularization and non-religion, especially from a cross-national and a comparative perspective. Second co-author Ryan Cragun is professor of empirical sociology at the University of Tampa in Florida. His research focuses on both the non-religious as well as on Mormonism, and it's been published in a variety of scholarly journals and presses. And then finally, we have our third co-author, Phil Zuckerman, who's an associate dean as well as professor of sociology at Pitzer College in California, and the founding chair of the nation's first secular studies program. And he's also the executive director of Humanist Mutual Aid Network, right? So I'm really excited about the discussion today. I read the book over the summer. I was saying to the authors, it was my beach reading book for this year. I use secularization theories a lot in my own work, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from the authors about the current day state of the secularization framework, as well as how it could be developed and pushed further in the coming years for those of us who use it. So the authors, I think especially Phil, is going to talk about their new book for the next 20 minutes to half an hour. And then after that, we'll open up the session for Q&A. And so hopefully we'll have another half an hour for questions and answers from the audience after the presentation. So Isabella, Ryan, and Phil, congratulations on the new book. Thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Well, good morning. At least it's morning here in California. I don't know what it is where you all are. What a nice view to see everybody. So many colleagues and friends and big names, and so how fun, how exciting. Thank you for joining, and thanks for having us. Some of you may have heard this a little bit. I think I did a session a year or so ago. I remember Peter was there. So if some of this is repeat, forgive me. I think I did a session on, people who still think Rodney Stark is right or something like that. I forget or how could Rodney Stark be so wrong? I think that's what it was called. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background for the writing of this book, what prompted it, some highlights, and then given the array of who's here, I assume we would have no shortage of questions, comments, discussions, debates. So that we probably will be the funnest part of the event today. So let me just give a little bit of background. In a way, well, I'll start with my own, and I start in the book with this, but when I was in graduate school 30 years ago at the University of Oregon, I was a young, happy, I had just discovered the sociology of religion. I didn't even know it existed, but I took a class called Sociology of Religion with a Professor Ben Johnson, who was a pretty big name in his day, and maybe still today. People remember Ben. He's still doing well. And I just, I felt like I was home. Oh, this is it. This is it. This is it. And I just fell in love with the sociology of religion and continued to pursue it in graduate school. But what was happening in the United States then, let's see, this is, I want to say the 90s, was we were all being taught that secularization hadn't occurred, that it was a wish of some disgruntled atheists from Europe who hated religion and just wanted to see it go away. People like Freud and Marx and others who just didn't like religion, thought it was irrational, and wanted it to disappear, so decided to say that it was going to disappear, but they just didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't have any data. It was all half-baked. It was all, they just were haters on religion and wanted to see it go away. And the truth, the empirical truth, the data-driven truth was that secularization hadn't occurred. In fact, it can't occur because religion is such a universal, constant need of human beings. So Rodney Stark was king, and Roger Finke and Lawrence Iannacone and all of them seemed to sort of have set the record straight. They seem to have righted the ship and got everybody to realize that secularization is a failed theory that ought to be tossed into the graveyard of failed theories. And I'm quoting good old Stark there. And, as a young grad student, I was like, oh, and I kind of like, it looked good. It looked legit. They had these propositions and they had data and it was very formalized. And, I went back. I couldn't really find much in Durkheim about secularization. Everybody always said that he wrote about secularization, but I couldn't find much. And yeah, I guess Weber just said a few things about disenchantment or whatever the German word is. And, and I just started to think I guess they're right. I guess secularization actually isn't occurring. And I started as a professor teaching sociology of religion. Everybody was reading Stark. That was at least here in the USA. But of course, year after year after year after year, we started to see, we being sociologists of religion, that religion was very much in decline. And everybody talked about Europe as some exception, that yes, religion is fading in the Nordic world and in the UK, but that's just because their firms are lazy and they have monopolies and they don't know how to meet the needs of people. And people are rationally choosing religions like they would toothpaste. And if the toothpaste companies don't do a good job of marketing a new brand, why people will stop buying the toothpaste. But as soon as some upstart firms, can market some new toothpaste, everybody will buy toothpaste again. And same goes for religion. And even folks up in Canada seem to buy this. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name, sweet man, but he seemed, the
Reg Bibby.
Yeah, Reginald.
Yeah,
Reg.
Reg.
Great, wonderful colleague, but he was writing about look, we were wrong about secularization. It's actually not happening, Anyway, but the data kept coming. More and more national surveys, more and more international surveys. Places, speaking of Canada, places like British Columbia. We just kept seeing these measures of belief, behavior, and belonging going down. And then, of course, the big story here in the USA was the rise of the so-called nuns, NONESs. And so year after year after year, more data kept coming out from more sources, whether it's Pew, whether it was PRI, whether it was Gallup, whether it was NORC, all the different ways we can get data started showing this decline of religion. And not just in Europe, but all over the world, places like South Korea, parts of Latin America. And of course, the big story here for us in the United States was the US. And so Isabella, myself, and Ryan are part of this group of people that are interested in secularity or non-religion, whichever term you prefer. It's an area of interest for us, that how people live their lives without religion and the effects of culture on a culture when religion seems to wane. And we were at a conference in St. Louis, and we went out for Thai food in Missouri, which right there is, you got to give us some credit. That's pretty bold, I think. If I remember, they didn't have much. I remember I was like, I'll take the pad Thai. And they were like, ooh, we're out of pad Thai. Do you remember that? And then I was like, okay, I'll do the pad CU. And they were like, we're kind of out of that too. But I think we finally got something good, some duck soup or something. And we said, you know what? We've got to set the record straight. Now, the only voice that seemed to counter Stark, of course, was good old Steve Bruce, who we love Steve's work. We find it rigorous. We find it empirically sound and theoretically exciting. But it just wasn't receiving the same attention that we felt it deserved. And we also had some other ways we wanted to approach this. So we thought we should write a book that sort of says, wait a minute, because we felt that there was no US published book that sort of countered what had been the reigning notion for 30 years, which was that secularization didn't happen, couldn't happen, wouldn't happen. And so we decided to write this book, and we split it up 3 ways, and we took different chapters and we did different areas. And so the idea was, in a way, even though it's a sort of anti-Stark book, there were some things we respected about Stark's work. Like we did like in Acts of Faith, how he had these, clear propositions that you could say, okay, this is what we mean by this. And when this happens, this is the result. And here's how you could test that. Here's how you could prove that. And when we looked through most of the classical work on secularization, you could find propositions here and there, but it hadn't been laid out in a way that we felt was felicitous and new and clear. And I think we kind of had your average undergrad in mind as we were writing this book. Now, the other backstory before I get into what we argue is just Isabella's, which I've told as well, and she could probably tell it better, but I'll just tell it anyway. Isabella was comes from Sweden and finds herself in Bakersfield, California, which is not the best part of California, but it's fine, fair, it's good enough. And was taking and I think you were taking a social class, Isabella, maybe even social religion. And again, reading all this stuff from Stark saying secularization doesn't happen and blah, blah, blah. And as an undergrad, sort of coming from highly secularized Sweden, sort of raised her hand and was like, I don't think any of this holds any water. Like, this is not how people act. This is not very sociological, and it's not true. Like, secularization has occurred. And if I remember correctly, the instructor said, well, if that's the case, go do your own research and prove it wrong. And which was, great advice, because Isabella has made a successful career doing just that. So I think there was a little bit of revenge there, motivating some of us to sort of get back. So what did we do? We went through classical sociological secularization theory, what we could find. We read the major works, we read the stuff, everybody's been writing about secularization for a long time, and we tried to pull out some of the key propositions. How could we word those in a clear, modern way? And how could we word them so that they can be tested, that they can be falsified? How can we present them as propositions that can be wrong or right, depending on the data? And we worked with belief, behavior, and belonging as our measures. And of course, as you know, those are big too. So you had to kind of boil it down and what kind of data is available. And maybe people don't like belief, behavior, and belonging as a way to measure religiosity. Maybe people don't like what types of belief or behaviors or belonging we decided to use as variables. That's the name of the game. That's what we do. We did the best we could with the best available data. And what we found was, according to these propositions of classical secularization theory, yes, in fact, religion plummets when these things are present. And we basically walked through what we mean by religion, what we mean by secularization, what are the highlights of secularization theory, and then we sort of present the global evidence, and we show, yes, this is exactly how it's playing out, and the data is robust, and the data is strong, and then we decided to do a closer look on. So we do sort of a global snapshot in one chapter. It's called the evidence part 1, and then the next chapter is evidence part 2, and we picked 4 societies that we decided to hone in on. One, Norway, which, typically you would go with Sweden. Sweden seems to always be the highlight when talking about secularization. Next, you'd go for Denmark. So we purposely went for Norway because, come on, gotta give Norway a little bit of love, and also to show that, even, everybody knows about Sweden and Denmark. We wanted to highlight. Then we went into Latin America, to Chile, and even there we could have done Uruguay. Uruguay stands out as the most secular, but we didn't want to pick the low-hanging fruit. And then we go to South Korea. We could have done Japan. So we actually purposely picked some nations that don't always make the headlines. And then, of course, we picked the United States, because why the hell would NYU ever publish our book if we picked Canada? This is the nature of the beast. We have to do USA to get published. So sorry, my Canadians. My wife's Canadian citizenship just came through, so I'm very happy. I'll be moving there soon. Okay. Next up, what we did, so we just lay it out. And, how do you lay out this data without it being kind of boring? I mean, we could just keep showing survey result after survey result. But what I think we did, which was important, we tried to show change over time. So it's not just a snapshot. And we try to say, like, we've now got, decades almost of data that goes back in some cases 75 years or more. So you can see the change over time. We've got the international comparisons to make. I think what we add that you don't find, for example, in some of Steve's defense of secularization theory as well, are a couple chapters. One is called "Is Being Secular Unnatural?" And this was in response, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a whole contingent now led by people like Christian Smith, who now the rational choice seems to have kind of run out of steam, but now they're taking this new approach which says that we are sort of born innately religious, and that's why secularization cannot ever get anywhere, because it would go against our human nature. So we had to sort of, and that's Justin Barrett is big in that front. Christian Smith is big in that front. So we tried to pick some of the big names who are sort of pushing that, which we just find very bizarre, very asociological, and just not supported by the evidence. So we try to lay out as much as we can, showing that, well, what do you mean by natural, unnatural? How are you using these terms? And if you're using them the way that we think you're using them, you're incorrect. And here's why we think being religious and being secular are both natural manifestations of the human experience in different rates in different places for different people. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But even people like Paul Froese wrote a book saying that, well, the Soviet experiment in secularization failed because humans are naturally religious. Not that secularization in the Soviet Union failed because it was done by the barrel of a gun and a boot and a torture chamber, which is not how anybody ever theorized secularization occur. I never read anybody that said, well, when Soviets come into your town with tanks and burn your church and arrest your priests, that's how secularization occurs. Of course not. There's forced secularization, which understandably doesn't work, and there's organic secularization, which occurs from the various processes which we lay out in the book. And when that's the case, it happens. We also have a chapter called "What Secularity Looks Like." Again, I think that's adding to what the kind of what Steve Bruce has done, where we try to give a more qualitative view of living a secular life. And again, we had undergrads in mind, because I think that if we just reduce secularization or secularity or non-religion to these surveys, this percentage believes in this, but now this percentage doesn't. And this percentage used to go to church, but now this percentage doesn't. And this percent used to get married in a church, and now, if that's all you're doing, I think it gives a lacking portrait of the social world today, which is that millions of people are living their lives without religion, and they're raising their kids, and they're working their jobs, and they're pursuing their hobbies, and they're engaged in social movements, and they are falling in and out of love. And it's sort of like, I don't know, I was just up in Aberdeen, and David Vose gave this wonderful presentation, and he said, everybody talks about invisible religion. That's BS. The real story is invisible secularity. And I was just kind of blown away. I was like, he's so right. Like, we don't talk about secularity and how it manifests itself, or non-religion, in the day-to-day lives. And so we decided to have a chapter called "What Secularity Looks Like," where we just give a sort of brief overview of what it means to live, what is, religious indifference, what are some secular values, organizations and communities, life cycle rituals, all the ways, raising children. I'm looking through the book here. Aging and getting old, dealing with crises and hard times and trauma. And I felt like that was a really important chapter to add, and I was glad we did, because again, I can imagine undergrads reading it and reflecting on their own lives and being like, oh, okay. Secularization isn't just about statistics, it's actually how I'm living my life right now. Or, they can look at their own. There's a wonderful picture of Isabella's, is it your grandfather or great-grandfather?
Yeah, I think it's my great-great-grandfather, actually.
Great-great-grandfather. And he's got some oxen, and he's pulling some wagons, and they're bringing, looks like, some seriously good hay to market. And this was an illustration of secularization in Sweden and Isabella's own lineage. But we hope that students will read this and think about their own family, their own parents, their own grandparents, their own great-grandparents, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm seeing this in my own life and in my own family background. We also have a chapter on exceptions. So a lot of people will say, but what about this? What about that? How do you explain this? How do you explain that? Ryan really took the lead on this. And we talk about the former USSR, and we talk about forced secularization, and we talk about the rise of religion in some former Soviet societies. And we actually argue that the rise of religiosity in some of these atypical places does not refute secularization theory, but actually fits the model. When you have these things occur, we would expect, when you have insecurity, when you have inequality, when you have upheaval, when you have these things, we would expect, or nationalism surging and cultural defense, all those things, we would expect to see an uptick of religiosity. So in fact, these exceptions are not disproving any of our assertions, but in fact bolstering them. We remain open to data disproving our proposals and propositions, and that's why we try to frame it like it's a matter of data. Show us the data, and these are all falsifiable. And then we sort of conclude and sum up. So that's a sort of brief overview. I think what's new about it is it's the most current data we could find. And like I said, it lays it out in propositions similar to the way Stark and Finke did in Acts of Faith. It's accessible to undergrads. I think it's a quick read. And we offer those other chapters about lived secularity, certain exceptions, and is religiosity natural or unnatural? Is secularity natural, unnatural? So those are some of the highlights. What I will say is, just anticipating some critiques, and then we'll open it up if that's okay. There's no question that some people would argue that these are old categories, these are old ways of looking at things. Haven't we moved beyond this? Isn't secularization theory just a sort of oppressive construct of colonialism, and shouldn't we abandon it? And I have lots of things to say on that, but basically we feel like, no, we can still talk about religion in terms of belief, behavior, and belonging. There are still standard measures of religiosity. You have to have some kind of measure of what it is you're talking about. And if religion, is everything, then it's impossible to measure. It's impossible to grasp. If religion is gardening, if religion is cooking, if religion is playing football or soccer, then I think we lose what we mean by religion. And this is what we mean by religion. Others are free to mean something else by religion. So it's all kind of boils down to how you define religion. And I guess you could say we are defining religion in a traditional Protestant way, if you like, and we're guilty as charged. People are free to define religion other ways. But the way we see it is that these are still useful categories. They are still meaningful variables. They still capture something that's going on out there. We don't think that in societies that are low in supernatural religious belief, low in behavior of traditional religious behaviors, and low in people identifying as religion, we haven't seen evidence that those societies are bursting with other versions of religion, just overflowing and bubbling with other versions of piety and spirituality and religious behavior. But again, we're open to that data, should it be out there. So I think I've gotten some feedback from others who just don't like this kind of traditional approach to religion, to secularization, and that's all good and fine. But I guess we are still in this discussion, in this debate. We still find value in the classical theorists. The classical theorists made some remarks. They really didn't give us rigorous propositions. They certainly didn't give us extensive data. They just sensed that something was occurring in Europe. And actually, their sense was spot on. They were right. They didn't perhaps articulate it as clearly as we would like. They certainly didn't provide the empirical data, but they were sensing a change. And that change has proven to be exactly what they were sensing, which is a rapid and incredible decline in religiosity in much of Europe, but not just Western Europe, but in Ireland, in Poland, and not just those parts of Europe, but around the world, in places like Latin America, Southeast Asia. We have a little bit of evidence of some little bit of secularization in Africa. Africa still remains perhaps the most robustly religious region of the world, but we still see some evidence of secularization, particularly in the Maghreb, in North Africa. We see some evidence of secularization in certain Middle Eastern societies. Of course, it's difficult to get valid data from some of these societies. China is always tricky because of the dictators there who are against religion. And so, you have to be very skeptical of kind of national data that comes out of China as well. But we did the best we could with the best available evidence. And we believe that secularization is beyond doubt, and that Stark and his colleagues were mistaken. And I think that the strangest thing for me, and I'll end on this personal note, was what it says about our discipline when leading scholars can be so rigorous, theoretically precise, empirically supported, and yet be so off, be so wrong about what's actually happening in the world. And what does that say about the tools we use? What does that say about our biases? What does that say about the viability of our enterprise? And so those are some of the things I'll leave you with. And now we welcome comments, discussion, critiques, questions. And I don't know how that will be moderated, Sarah.
Oh, thanks, Phil. Yeah, no, thank you, Phil. Great background summary, really interesting. Yeah, I'll help moderate the Q&A session. So if anyone, as questions come up, as you want to ask questions, you can either post them in the chat if you like, or just an indication that you'd like to ask a question in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. And so, yeah, the floor is open. We've got another half hour. Okay, Peter, you've got your hand raised. Go for it.
Thanks. This is actually kind of a lit review question. You mentioned Steve Bruce as kind of one of the holdouts, and it's certainly the case, but much of actually what you said, what came to my mind was Engelhardt and Norris. And I wondered how what are you saying that they haven't already said? I guess I'll just phrase it that way in order to get at that question.
Thank you. We certainly use their work. We certainly include the existential security as a major predictor of secularization. But Isabella, Ryan, do you want to handle that one?
I can jump in on that if you want. So thank you, Peter. That's actually a great question. Chapter 1, I guess, where we dig in deep into secularization, we do, as Phil said, we incorporate Norris and Engelhardt. And Ron Engelhardt, in kind of his most recent book, he pushes in a lot of the similar directions as to what we're doing. But our theory is actually a lot bigger than just existential security. So I think what we would argue is there are a lot of other mechanisms that actually play into declining religiosity around the world. We have some nice little models in there that illustrate and kind of drop existential security into different parts of the model. So we would say Norris and Engelhardt gave us a really important mechanism that helps contribute to secularization, but it's not the only one. And it's kind of a part of the bigger theory of secularization. It's a very important one, so we're certainly not discounting it. But I think the way that we're thinking about secularization is actually much bigger than just that one piece. We think there are other ways that secularization plays out than just existential security. So it is a great question. You'll have to read the chapter to get all the details.
You have to buy the book. All right, Corey, go for it.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Isabella, Phil, and Ryan for this. It's super interesting, and look forward to reading the book in more detail. Just a quick question. I'm wondering at what point in this study and writing the book did you arrive at your definition of religion? And specifically your focus on the supernatural in this definition, was that something you saw in the data, or is that something that you kind of went in with before you started doing the actual analysis?
I can take this one if you like. I think all three of us agreed before we even started the book that we focus primarily on kind of a substantive definition of religion, focusing on religious beliefs as the primary measure of religiosity. And that's actually another aspect kind of this where we, for the most part, agree with Stark's work. He also focused on religious belief as the primary measure. And just kind of like what Phil was saying, that of course, behaviors and belonging are also indicators of religiosity, but to us they're more the secondary indicators, because somebody could go to a religious service. So somebody could identify as, you know, belonging to a church, or you know, being religious in some extent, as we see in the Scandinavian countries and so on. But if they don't believe in what's said there, or if they don't believe in the doctrine, to us they are actually more secular than they're religious. So we agreed on this before we started the book, but then we kind of worked out the more detailed definition from there. I don't know if you want to add something to that, Phil and Ryan.
Yeah, it's just funny because Stark has some line in one of his books like, a religion without supernatural beliefs is no religion at all, or something. And so even though we disagree with so much of Stark, we agree with that. And again, people are free to define religion another way. We're not saying this is the only way to define religion. It's just, this is the way we do. And yeah, it was done first, not, you know, it was done in the beginning. Like, what is it we're trying to measure? What is it that we mean? And that's where we focused.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, Dusty, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to, I know the book mentions that our theories or our model differs from Steve Bruce's book, Secularization in Defense of an Unfashionable Theory. I thought maybe could you guys just elaborate, in what ways do you see your work as obviously in line with his, and also in what ways does it differ from Steve Bruce's book?
Should I jump in on this one as well? We are very dependent upon Bruce, right? So we're not trying to say that, like, I think we fully agree with him on a lot of things. And in some ways, like, we're like standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Like, Bruce really did lay out a lot of this. Similar to what we're doing with Norris and Engelhardt, I think we're incorporating a lot of that, but we're also simplifying it and formalizing it. And I think that's something that, you know, I've read like everything Bruce has ever written. I jokingly say that, like, you know, in my list of people that I would like to meet, none of them are, you know, movie stars. It's Steve Bruce. I've never met him, right? Like, he is my hero. But he never actually formalized the theory. So he's got like these really complex ideas in there, and I think they're amazing. They're really insightful. So one of the things that we did is we moved a little bit beyond that and just kind of formalized it, but we also incorporated a couple of things that he has never directly incorporated. So one of those, we talked about existential security, but also this idea that generational change is another mechanism, right? So where you see a lot of the secularization happening, yes, some people as they age, they drop out, but a lot of it is actually in the failure to transmit religion from parents to children. And I think that's a really important piece. And increasingly, there's evidence to suggest that this is where a lot of the secularization is happening, is that kids are just not going to church, right? So kids don't want to go, the parents don't make them, and then you see that transition outward, like the kids just stop being religious. So we have a couple of things that we add on to it, but a lot of it is also just formalizing the work of Steve Bruce, because, I mean, you're right, like, he's done amazing things. So we are very, very dependent upon Bruce here.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, I'll just add too. It's not counter. It's maybe just like adding on to. So I think we have more international data than you'll find in Secularization Defense of an Unfashionable Theory, which I think still is very Euro focused. So we bring in stuff from, you know, the whole planet, and then also we bring in that qualitative chapter, which Bruce does not do. So there's just, I think it's just more embellishing, refining, you know, re-emphasizing, but it's certainly in the same vein as Steve Bruce's work.
All right, Joseph, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for this event. This is cool, this series. I just think it's excellent. And good to see everybody. So I think this book is really important, and it's interesting to listen to Phil and to listen to some of the questions. It feels like a final statement on a way of doing sociology of religion, and it's like an end point for that. And I think that that's really helpful and powerful. And it couldn't be that if it weren't solid and just like a very clear statement. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on, you know, what that might allow us to think next in sociology of religion. And I'm especially thinking about the difficult task I give my PhD students on their exams, which is, here, read the really good literature on secularization, see that, you know, what you've shown in Beyond Doubt is the case, but also read like Talal Asad and some of the new work on like, secular feelings, that's really interesting, and coming out of Europe and coming out of the Cultures of Unbelief project, which obviously we've also been involved with. So is there a way in which, do you see a way in which this might end one conversation and begin another? And if that's the case, do you see anywhere next going? Is this the death of sociology of religion that you kind of marked out? Or then what maybe looks like something next if this isn't the final statement?
That's a really difficult question. I guess I get started. I mean, I don't think it's the death of sociology of religion. I did an interview somewhere else a few weeks ago, and the interviewer was asking, so are you saying that the world is becoming less religious? And actually, that's not really what we're saying in the book. We're saying that under certain conditions, in certain society, religion is becoming, much less present and much less socially significant. So I mean, there's no doubt that religion is still really powerful in loads of places, including in societies that are secularizing. So I definitely don't think that's the case. And I also think there's more to do on secularization theory. This isn't necessarily the kind of the final statement on it. There's lots that still needs to be done in relation to gender and class and other areas as well. So and kind of what Phil was speaking about earlier with the cross-national data, we do have a lot of work that needs to be done to understanding how things play out differently in different contexts. I know that it's easy to criticize the cross-national data because we are trying to predict things across cultures in different societies with different histories and so on, and that's a fair criticism. But at the same time, we are seeing some general trends and some general patterns even across cultures, and that's one of the reasons for why we picked, as Phil mentioned, South Korea and Chile and Norway and the United States, because they are, relatively, both similar in terms of their secularization, but also different historically and religiously and so on. So there's definitely lots of work that still needs to be done. But I don't know if one of you want to jump in on this as well.
Phil, you wanted anything, or
I got a couple things to say.
Yeah,
and then,
do it. Go.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. That's a great question. A few things jumped to mind when you said it. So the first thing for me, was I do like the broader notion of worldviews or life ways as a kind of broader category now. So it's just like worldviews, value systems in general, which would incorporate supernatural and naturalistic worldviews. So it's almost like I think there's some promise there, broadening these categories. That's one thing I'll say. The next thing I'll say is, as a sociologist, we always have to contend with deviance, right? Like, so what we're always talking about is the way we are socialized and how we conform to norms and the way we are shaped by our society. But, in any intro to social class, you're going to get a student that says, well, what about that person that doesn't do that or that goes this? You always have to contend with deviance. And I feel like for much of human history, or I'm not a historian, so let me scratch that. I'm going to say for the last couple hundred years, religiosity was so normative that really the deviants, that were the non-believers, the non-religious folks. But now I sort of see like we're going to have to shift that frame so that actually the believers are going to be the sort of odd ducks that we have to sort of make sense of. And I'm currently interviewing Estonians of all people, and I'm doing in-depth interviews with Estonians. And I gotta say, like in that context, there is something to be said about like religion is just not, even in Scandinavia, religion has a sort of benign cultural joy. People kind of dig, but the Estonians are just like most Danes that I interviewed would still say they're Christian, like, because to be Christian and to be Danish are sort of very similar. But the Estonians that I'm interviewing, like, religion is really something separate from their national identity, their consciousness, their life. And so the folks that are religious in Estonia are the deviant ones, right? In the sociological sense. I don't mean in a pejorative sense. I mean, they're the norm violators. And I sort of feel like we're going to have to reframe. I was just up in Scotland, and it was like, from what I could observe and the people I spoke with, the only churches that are doing anything are immigrant churches, primarily immigrants from Africa. Like Aberdeen is like the most unchurched city in all of the UK. So what does sociology of religion look like in a place like Aberdeen? On some level, I think traditional sociology of religion may be dead there because there's just nothing to study. So instead, it's becoming a study of sort of the deviants, the people in the margins, the people on the that are non-normative, and so on and so forth. And then yeah, those I think I'll stop there. Ryan, I'm curious how you would answer Joseph's question.
Actually, you hit at it when you talked about worldviews and life stances. I was going to say, I think that's a big part of the future path. The only thing that I might add, we have an example in the book on Iceland when we're talking about, those who argue that what's happening is actually not decline but change. And the example we get from Iceland is like, yeah, there may be a whole bunch of people in Iceland who believe in elves, right? And our measures aren't capturing that. So that's fair. But even though we're not capturing that, right? We still think it's important to know that religious attendance is declining, religious affiliations declining, and these kind of more traditional measures of belief are declining, which opens up exactly what Phil was saying, right? This space to study what is outside of those traditional measures of organized religion, right? So are there a whole bunch of people who believe in elves in Iceland? Yes. And is that a supernatural belief? Yes. And we can study that. And that's really interesting. We're not saying that we can't study those things that fall outside of these traditional measures, only that we need to continue to measure these things, right? Because that reflects change in society over time. And I think that's really, really important. But I think Joe's question is a great question. I don't know that this is the end of the sociology of religion. I don't think we had that big of a vision for the book when we wrote it. Would we kind of like this to be the end of people saying secularization is not happening? Maybe, right? That might be the extent of how high we were reaching with the book, but certainly not the end of the sociology of religion. It's a great question, Joe. Appreciate it.
All right, Brathy, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Phil and Isabella and Ryan. Great discussion actually. So I have a few questions. Number one on methodology. When you spoke about people identifying themselves as Christians or belonging to a particular religion, but not really believing that, how did you measure that particular aspect, and how did you bring that data into your theory of secularization? That is number one. And one thing I found is, can you elaborate a bit more on the class aspect of this non-religion? Because from what I see, from about 60s and 70s in US and in many other places, there has been a proliferation of new religious movements, and these new religious movements back certain Oriental or Eastern religion in a particular way, so that it appears in a secularized garb. How do we account for New Age religion in this manner? And these new religious movements are particularly catering towards a middle class population in most countries. So how do we understand the class aspect of it also? And you already answered, Phil already answered this aspect about how do we understand the role of nation state in understanding religion. But if you could elaborate more on that, it would be good. Thank you.
I can say something about the measurements and the methodology. So as Phil mentioned, we have two chapters that focus on, they're more sort of specifically focusing on laying out the data. And in the first chapter, we look at the more global trends. So when we do that, we're taking primarily one measure of religious beliefs and one measure of behavior and one of belonging. And for that one, we're looking at whether or not a respondent believes in God. And we know that this is a crude measure. It doesn't get to all the nuances of how people believe. But when looking at it at the cross-national, at the global scale, for this one, we're using World Values Survey and European Value Study data, and also some data from the International Social Survey Program. So we are using those kind of measure. We're looking at a measure of identifying with a religious organization and also attendance at religious services. These are, of course, there's challenges around sort of comparing these across different cultures and religion. But so what we're doing in the following chapter, when we're looking at the case studies, and we're looking at South Korea and Chile and Norway and the United States, we can use a wider range of measures. So we are using measures that look at whether or not a person identifies as an atheist. We're looking at whether or not somebody believes in a higher power. We're looking at other measures of religious praying and so forth. So we are using as as many measures as we could find, as and especially the data from the International Social Survey Program, religion modules, they have quite a variety of ways to measure religiosity. So we are using that, but again, we do acknowledge that this is by no means sort of perfect, and that's why, just as Ryan mentioned, we have to kind of continue to think of how to measure religiosity moving forward. I don't know if you want to take one of the other questions, Phil or Ryan?
I can jump in on the NRM question if you want, and Phil, if you want to address nation states and their relationship to religion and our definition, that might be helpful. But so the question about new religious movements, I think, is an interesting one. To argue that they're growing, I mean, yes, technically they're growing, but in no measurable way are they offsetting the losses, right? So if we saw new religious movements just like massively offsetting all these losses, that everybody who's leaving traditional kind of, stage religions that have been around a long time, I don't know what you call old religious movements, right? Because we got to contrast them with new religious movements. If we saw all of the people leaving the old religions joining new religious movements, then I think we would have to really rethink the secularization framework. But the vast majority of people who leave actually don't join new religious movements, don't turn towards spiritual practices, new age practices. They don't actually do any of those things. They become kind of indifferent to most everything. There's actually a question in the chat that we should get back to about indifference, which I think is a great question. And Isabella has the best answer for this, so I'm going to kind of let her address that. And you should check the chat question. But so I think NRMs are interesting. The social class thing on NRMs, I'm actually working on a paper on that right now that I'll be presenting at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion conference in October. So I don't want to scoop myself, but I've got a student who's working on that, and we're going to be addressing that question directly. So it's a great question, and people are working on that. See if Bill's going to take it.
You got to prompt me. What was the question about nation states?
So it was about nation states and the relationship to our definition of religion. So how does religion overlap with nation states, if I got that correctly?
We don't really get into that. I mean, obviously different cultures are going to understand and define religion differently. Within certain nation states, you can have multiple versions of peoples, tribes, cultures. So just because, there's a political map does not always equate a social map or a cultural map or a national map. You can have multiple nationalities within society, a nation state. So it's complex. We definitely just sort of stick with the political designations of what countries are what countries, and we don't really get into the diversity within those nation states in terms of worldview, orientation, and that's, so it's a rough analysis, and a more nuanced analysis is certainly welcome on that front.
Okay, so like Ryan mentioned, we've got quite a few questions in the chat now, so I'll go to the first one. So John Longhurst asks, can you offer a few thoughts about what you saw in Canada, resecularization and religion, and about Reg BB's approach and ideas?
I'm awfully tempted to say, Sarah, do you want to talk about secularization in Canada?
I mean,
you
we
are
could talk all day about this.
Expert here. So.
I mean, it's all what you guys say is applicable to Canada. What's interesting about Reg's work is that in the 80s and 90s, he was very much a proponent of secularization theories. If you read his earlier stuff, I like his earlier stuff better for that reason. And then somewhere around the late 90s and 2000s, he shifts towards more, I guess he was more inspired by what Rodney Stark was doing. And I've spoken to him a bit about it before. I don't want to speak for him, but he mentioned it. He was kind of also getting a bit sick of being told by all his church folks that he was the bearer of bad news. And so I think that he wanted maybe a more positive outlook. And I think maybe that's why one of the reasons he got on board with Stark's work. But yeah, it's happening in Canada. I mean, again, all of these questions and thoughts about how we define religion and non-religion are all valid here as well. But it's definitely a lot fewer people are involved in organized religions of any kind than they were, say, 50 or 100 years ago, right?
Yeah. The only thing I would add there is I've actually used a publication of Bibby's. And I actually agree with you. I think Bibby, 40 years ago, we were pretty close to the same page. And then he took this weird turn. And I've used one of his papers, I think it was, as an illustration of how not to measure religiosity, because he started introducing these really weird measures that you're like, how are you arriving at religiosity with this? And it was, in essence, to make it seem as though religiosity wasn't declining. So, it's a good illustration of the way that you can actually manipulate and massage data by just subtly altering questions and trying to get them to align with what it is you're trying to say. So, and I'm not trying to be mean to him. I think he had.
There is one interesting exception, though, that you guys touch on a little bit in the book, is that's the overall belief in life after death has actually not declined in Canada. And we've seen that through quite a few different surveys, and you see it in a few different countries. But I know that you guys have seen a decline trend in other contexts, but it's like the one indicator that kind of doesn't seem to go through the same trend always.
Oh, that's interesting. Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we also have to remember that Peter Berger did the same thing. I mean, it wasn't just Reginald, like the great Peter Berger, same deal, like gave us these great works on how secularization works, and then also jumped ship and joined Stark and said I was wrong, even though, no data. The one example that I always got me, because I remember seeing like an article, I think it was like Stark and Ava Homburg co-authored something about Sweden and Japan. It was a while ago, but I remember they were like, the question was, do you think about the ultimate meaning of life? And they said, aha, a lot of people do, thus religion's alive and well. And Marxists do nothing but think about the ultimate meaning of life. I mean, what kind of a question? If that's what you mean by religion, then everybody's religious. I mean, everybody thinks about, nationalists are consumed with it. Political movements are consumed with it. Vegetarians or vegans do. I mean, so that's an example of like, fine, if you want to call religion ultimate, that you are concerned about the ultimate meaning of life, go ahead, but that's going to encapsulate the most atheistic movements you can imagine. I just find it's just not as useful to me because it's too big of a net, and suddenly everything is. So I'm more interested in those narrower definitions of religion that I think are more interesting.
Okay, so I'm gonna try and work through as many of these questions in the chat as I can. So Julia Martinez asks, thank you for the presentation and the book, which I've started reading this week. Woo! My question is about your take on the multiple secularities concept. Why do you think it's not a useful concept to understand different cultural differentiations between religion and other spheres? Thank you.
I think this is going to fall back on me. This is covered in the theory chapter. Yeah, so I'm not saying that it's a concept that can't be used. The example that I like to give is that so clearly the secular and the relationship between government and religion is going to differ in lots of different countries, right? But the example I like to give is democracy looks different in lots of different countries, yet rarely do we hear anybody say that there are multiple democracies, right? So I just don't like the framing of like multiple secularities. Clearly, what is secular, right, is going to vary by context. I think that's kind of almost obvious. Why that has to be an entire framework doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Everything's contextual, right? This is why we had like that big overview chapter, and then we dive into specific countries and say, look, it's playing out slightly different in different countries. South Korea is a fascinating illustration of secularization because you actually saw an uptick in religiosity in the 1980s, followed by a dramatic drop-off through to today, right? So clearly secularization plays out in different contexts, and that's perfectly fine. I personally don't find much utility in calling this multiple secularities. I'm not disagreeing with the general idea that it plays out in different ways in different contexts. I just don't see the utility in naming that specifically. And maybe my co-authors will disagree with me, and I welcome that.
Hot take. Phil, Isabella, you want to add to that?
I agree.
Not so hot take.
I mean, I'm excited by the notion of multiple secularities. I want to know how secularity plays itself out in multiple contexts, across time, across culture, across history, continents. Like, yeah, I dig it. I love it. I just go for it, please. We got our work cut out for us.
All right. So we have another question in the chat. Elizabeth Sirois asks, do you believe that there is an overemphasis on explicit non-religion, like atheists or secular humanist groups, that might draw our attention away from the real endpoint of secularization, that is religious indifference?
Yeah, I mean,
teed this up for Isabella. So Isabella, you want to take that one?
yeah, which story in particular did you refer to about what was interesting?
I was just saying, we had this debate when we were writing this, right? So as we were writing this, who is more secular, right? Is it the kind of out and out atheist who's like really out there on the front lines, or is it the person who never thinks about religion? And Isabella, I think you won that argument. Do you want to explain to everybody? Because you convinced me, and now I'm like, she wins.
Yeah, I don't know what evidence I use, but yeah, no, my argument would be that the person who never thinks or never talks about religion, who doesn't, potentially doesn't know much about religion, is the most secular. And I mean, we've shown in other works, and I know other authors have done this as well, that sort of explicit irreligion or atheism and secular humanism and so forth tend to be stronger where religion is also present. So it tends to be more polarized. People are looking for a place to find others who are like-minded, or they might feel like they need to defend their own identities and so on. So I, as Phil mentioned, I grew up in Sweden, in several generations of secular Swedes in my family, and when I started studying secularization, my grandparents were still alive, and I had a conversation with them about religion and about secularization, and they just realized they'd been married for over 50 years. They realized that they had never talked about religion with each other. My both of them were quite secular, but my grandfather was definitely more sort of strongly non-religious than my grandmother, and they both started just being really confused that they never even discussed this issue in all these years. And it wasn't because it was private or sensitive; it was just because it was such a non-issue. So to me, that's it's more secular than somebody who is out there attending atheist and freethinker meetings and so on. So yeah, that's I guess that's what I would say to it.
I mean, I guess the one thing we could add is if the question is getting at, we emphasize too much studying members of atheist and humanist groups, we are 100% in agreement on that. The tricky part is finding non-religious people. This is obviously how people do this for religion, right? Religion, it's easy to find people because they congregate. It's hard to find people who don't congregate, because where do you find them? You just kind of have to go out and look on the street or something, right? Like, where do you find them? So yeah, I think there has been too much research on people who are members of these groups and not enough on people who are not religious because they're religiously indifferent. These issues don't matter to them, but it's because they're hard to find, right? How do you find those people? It's just really challenging to do.
And people have never had to articulate their thoughts about religion before, like don't even have the same language or socialization in some ways, right? Yeah, really interesting, guys. Laurie also mentions in the chat that there's more to come on the belief after life and life after death question. The Non-Religion and the Complex Future Project's working on it, so look for future events there. Listen, I'd like to thank our three authors, Isabella, Phil, Ryan, for being here today, for generating this really interesting discussion. Again, congrats on the book. Great seeing you all, and see you at the next event.